My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm about to tell you the most difficult story of my life. 3 months ago, I was worth $2.8 billion. Today, I have exactly $423 in my checking account, and I've never been happier. But getting to this point nearly destroyed me, and cost me everything I thought I knew about my family, my father, and myself. It started on a Tuesday morning in September. I remember because I was sitting in my cubicle at Chen Industries, working on a marketing campaign for our new logistics software, when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was shaking. "Marcus, your father, there's been an accident." Richard Chen, my father, the man who built a shipping empire from nothing, had suffered a massive heart attack during a board meeting. By the time I reached the hospital, he was gone. Just like that, the man who seemed invincible, who worked 18-hour days well into his 60s, was reduced to a still figure under white sheets. I won't lie to you, the grief was overwhelming. But what came next was even more devastating. Harold Whitman, our family lawyer for over 20 years, called me to his office 3 days after the funeral. The mahogany-paneled room smelled like old leather and expensive cologne as he spread documents across his desk like tarot cards revealing an impossible future. "Marcus," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "your father has left everything to you. The shipping company, the manufacturing plants in Southeast Asia, the real estate holdings in 12 countries. You are now one of the wealthiest young men in America." I stared at the numbers on the page, unable to process them. Growing up, I knew we were comfortable. We lived in a nice house in Pacific Palisades, I went to private schools, never wanted for anything. But I worked in the marketing department of my father's company for 3 years, earning a modest salary, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica. I had no idea the true scope of Chen Industries. 10,000 employees worldwide. Operations on 6 continents. A fleet of cargo ships that moved everything from electronics to agricultural products across the Pacific. "There's one condition," Harold continued, his voice taking on a serious tone. "You must personally review all company operations within 90 days. Your father was very specific about this requirement. He said you needed to understand the business completely before you could truly inherit it." Harold handed me a sealed envelope, my father's handwriting spelling out my name across expensive stationery. "He wanted you to read this after our meeting, alone." That night, I sat in my apartment as rain hammered against the windows. Los Angeles doesn't get much rain, but when it comes, it feels like the city is washing away its sins. I held the envelope for over an hour, afraid of what I might find inside. My father and I had a complicated relationship. He loved me, I knew that, but he was distant, always traveling, always working. My mother used to joke that he loved his ships more than his family. She died when I was 16, cancer taking her slowly over 2 years. My father blamed himself for not catching it earlier, for being away so much during her treatment. Finally, I opened the letter. My father's neat handwriting filled 3 pages, and as I read his words, I felt like I was hearing his voice one last time. "My dear son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the weight of my choices now rests on your shoulders. I need you to know that everything I did, every decision I made, was for our family. When your mother got sick, when the medical bills were drowning us, when I had to choose between her life and my conscience, I chose her. I chose you. I chose our family's future, and I've been paying the price ever since." The letter continued, each word hitting me like a physical blow. "The early years of Chen Industries weren't built on legitimate shipping alone, Marcus. When we were desperate, when traditional banks wouldn't lend to a Chinese immigrant with broken English and big dreams, I found other investors. People who offered capital in exchange for services. I told myself it was temporary, that once the business was successful, I could walk away clean. I was wrong. Some partnerships, once begun, are impossible to end." My hands were shaking as I read the final paragraph. "The Southeast Asian shipping routes, the ones I always handled personally, are not what they appear to be in our official manifests. People pay enormous sums to come to America, Marcus, and sometimes they pay with more than money. You have 90 days to decide who you want to be. You can continue the business as it is, wealthy and willfully blind, or you can dig deeper and discover the full truth of what our empire is built upon. But I warn you, some knowledge, once gained, cannot be unknown. Choose carefully, my son. Choose better than I did. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process what my father had told me. The next morning, I called in sick and spent hours researching Chen Industries online, looking at our company with fresh eyes. Our primary business was container shipping between Asia and the American West Coast. We operated out of the port of Long Beach, moving everything from consumer electronics manufactured in China to agricultural products from Thailand and Vietnam. On paper, everything looked legitimate. But my father's letter kept echoing in my mind. The Southeast Asian routes. Services for investors. People paying with more than money. I needed answers, and I knew where to start. Sophia Reeves had been my father's executive assistant for over 15 years. If anyone knew his secrets, it would be her. I found Sophia at Chen Industries headquarters the next morning. The building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel in downtown Los Angeles, a monument to legitimate business success. Employees bowed respectfully as I walked through the lobby, already treating me like the new CEO. Sophia was waiting by the executive elevator, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of grief and stress. "Marcus, I'm so sorry about your father," she said as we rode up to the executive floor. He was a good man who carried heavy burdens. There was something in her voice, a careful weight to her words that made me pay attention. "The board is eager to meet with you this afternoon. There are some operational decisions that need your approval." I studied her face in the elevator's mirrored walls. Sophia was in her 40s, impeccably professional, with sharp intelligence behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had always been kind to me during my years working in the company, but kept appropriate distance as the boss's son. Now, something had changed. She seemed afraid. "Sophia," I said carefully, "I found a letter from my father. He mentioned the Southeast Asian routes, said I needed to understand all aspects of the business." What did he mean by that? Her reflection went pale in the mirrored elevator wall. She was quiet for a long moment as we reached the executive floor. "Your father was a complex man, Marcus. Maybe you should start by reviewing the shipping manifests for the Cambodian and Vietnamese routes. Container numbers starting with CSX. But..." She paused, her hand on the elevator button to keep the doors closed. "Be very careful who you trust. Your father had reasons for keeping certain information compartmentalized." That afternoon's board meeting was a surreal experience. 12 men and women in expensive suits, discussing quarterly projections and expansion plans, treating me with the deference reserved for a billionaire. But one man stood out, Viktor Kozlov, our Director of International Operations. He was probably in his 50s, built like a heavyweight boxer, with pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. His English was perfect but carried a slight accent that could have been Russian or Eastern European. "Young Chen," he said after the formal presentations ended, his voice carrying an undertone of amusement, "your father and I worked very closely together for many years. Perhaps we should schedule a private meeting to discuss the more nuanced aspects of our operations." When I announced that I planned to conduct a full operational review over the next 90 days, personally inspecting our facilities and shipping routes, the room fell silent. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes as he leaned back in his leather chair. "Some stones are better left unturned," he said quietly. Your father understood this. Prosperity sometimes requires selective blindness. The warning was clear, but I was past the point of turning back. That weekend, I drove to the port of Long Beach. Chen Industries operated a massive terminal there, hundreds of acres of concrete and steel where our ships loaded and unloaded cargo from across the Pacific. I had visited the facility several times over the years for company events, but always as a guided tour with my father, seeing only what he wanted me to see. This time, I came alone with my executive access card, walking through the facility like I belonged there. The port manager, Jake Morrison, was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked with my father for over a decade. When I told him I wanted to inspect some of our storage areas, particularly containers from the recent Vietnamese shipment, his demeanor shifted noticeably. "Those are in the secure area, sir," he said nervously. "Your father had specific protocols for the CSX containers. Maybe we should wait until Monday, get proper clearance." But I wasn't waiting. Using my access card, I made my way to the storage yard where hundreds of shipping containers sat in neat rows like giant metal dominoes. The CSX containers were segregated in a corner of the yard, surrounded by additional fencing and security cameras. According to the manifest Jake showed me reluctantly, these containers should have been empty, recently unloaded and awaiting cleaning before their next voyage. What I found inside the first container I opened changed everything. The space should have been empty metal walls and floor. Instead, I discovered makeshift bedding, thin blankets, plastic bottles for water, a bucket in the corner that had clearly been used as a toilet. The walls showed scratch marks, as if fingernails had clawed desperately at the steel. Personal belongings were scattered on the floor, a child's stuffed animal, a woman's photograph, rosary beads. I stumbled out of that container and vomited in the parking lot. The full horror of what I was seeing crashed over me like a wave. These weren't cargo containers. They were prison cells. Human beings had been locked inside these metal boxes, transported across the Pacific Ocean like freight. The scratch marks on the walls told a story of desperation and terror that I will never forget. Over the next week, I investigated deeper, following a trail that led me through the darkest corners of Los Angeles. Using shipping records and tracking numbers, I discovered that our cargo from Southeast Asia wasn't always goods and products. Sometimes it was people. Desperate families from rural Cambodia and Vietnam, paying life savings for passage to America. Men and women fleeing poverty and oppression, believing they were paying for safe transport and legitimate work opportunities. The reality was far more sinister. I met with Elena Vasquez, a social worker who ran a shelter for trafficking survivors in East LA. She didn't know who I was when I first contacted her, claiming to be a journalist investigating shipping companies. Her small office was filled with case files and photographs of missing persons, a wall of faces that haunted my dreams. The Chen shipping containers, she told me with barely controlled anger, they've become synonymous with modern slavery in the immigrant communities I work with. We've rescued dozens of people from those ships over the years. Women forced into prostitution, men worked to death in illegal factories, children who disappear into the foster system or worse. She showed me photographs that made my stomach turn. Emaciated people pulled from shipping containers, some barely alive after weeks at sea with minimal food and water. Medical reports documenting malnutrition, dehydration, sexual assault. Death certificates for those who didn't survive the journey, their bodies dumped at sea like garbage. Someone needs to stop it, Elena continued, her voice breaking with emotion. These people have names, families, dreams. They're not cargo. They're human beings who trusted criminals with their lives and their children's futures. When I finally revealed my identity, Elena's face hardened with disgust and fury. "So you're the prince inheriting the kingdom built on our bones," she said, standing up and pointing toward the door. "Get out of my office. I don't want your guilt money or your crocodile tears." But I couldn't leave. I sat in my car outside her office for hours, crying like I hadn't since my mother's funeral. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my father, about the source of our wealth, had been a lie. The comfortable life I'd lived, the private schools, the college education, my mother's medical treatments, all of it paid for with the suffering of innocent people. That night, I confronted Sophia at her home. She lived in a modest apartment in Koreatown, far from the luxury she could have afforded on her executive salary. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, her shoulders sagged like she'd been carrying an enormous weight. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Your father made me promise to help you understand, but only if you figured it out yourself first." Sophia's living room was neat and sparse, with photographs of family in Korea and a small Buddhist shrine in one corner. She made tea with shaking hands and told me a story that shattered what was left of my innocence. "It started small," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 20 years ago, your father was just another immigrant trying to build a business. When your mother got cancer and the medical bills started piling up, he was desperate. A man named Viktor Kozlov approached him with an offer, financial backing for the shipping company in exchange for moving special cargo occasionally. She explained how the operation grew over the years. What began as occasionally transporting a few undocumented immigrants became a sophisticated trafficking network. People in Cambodia and Vietnam paid thousands of dollars to criminal organizations, believing they were purchasing legitimate passage and work opportunities in America. Instead, they were loaded into shipping containers like livestock, transported across the Pacific in conditions that killed many of them. The survivors were sold, Sophia continued, tears streaming down her face. Men to illegal factories and agricultural operations. Women and girls to brothels and massage parlors. Children disappeared into adoption scams or worse. Your father tried to get out several times over the years, but Kozlov had too much leverage. There were photographs, recordings, financial records. If your father had tried to expose the operation, he would have gone to prison and destroyed your family's reputation. I learned that the trafficking operation was still running, managed by Kozlov and protected by a network of corrupt customs officials, port authorities, and local politicians. The money was enormous. Desperate people would pay everything they had for the promise of a new life in America, and those who survived the journey were sold for additional profit. Your father's heart attack wasn't entirely natural, Sophia said quietly. 3 days before he died, Kozlov presented him with expansion plans. They wanted to double the number of people per container, reduce costs by providing less food and water during transport. Your father refused, said he was done being part of mass murder. Kozlov told him that retirement wasn't an option. The stress and guilt, Sophia explained, had been killing my father slowly for years. The heart attack was his body finally surrendering under the weight of decades of complicity in human suffering. I spent that night walking the streets of Los Angeles, trying to process everything I'd learned. The city looked different now, every face making me wonder if they were someone who had escaped trafficking, or someone still trapped in it. The wealth I'd inherited felt like poison in my veins. The next morning, I received a call from Viktor Kozlov. His voice was pleasant, conversational, like he was inviting me to lunch rather than issuing a threat. "Marcus, we need to meet. There are aspects of your inheritance that require immediate attention." We met at a high-end restaurant in Beverly Hills, the kind of place where powerful men make deals over expensive wine. Kozlov arrived in a black Mercedes, accompanied by 2 men who looked like they'd stepped out of an action movie. He ordered for both of us in fluent Russian-accented English and got straight to business. "Your father was a good partner for many years," he said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "But toward the end, he became sentimental. Age does that to men, makes them soft, makes them forget the realities of business." He explained the operation in clinical terms, like he was discussing quarterly earnings rather than human trafficking. The Southeast Asian routes generated over $50 million annually in pure profit. The overhead was minimal, bribes to officials, fuel for the ships, minimal food and water for the cargo. The return on investment was extraordinary. "People want to come to America, we provide service," Kozlov continued with a cold smile. Everyone wins. The passengers get their new life, we get compensated for the risk, American businesses get cheap labor. It's capitalism at its purest. When I started to object, to mention the deaths and suffering, Kozlov's demeanor shifted. The pleasant businessman facade dropped, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. Your father tried to develop a conscience in his final years, he said quietly. It was unfortunate for his health. You're young, Marcus. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't make his mistakes. The threat was clear. Continue the operation quietly, or face the consequences. Kozlov explained that half the relevant officials were on his payroll, that exposing the trafficking network would be impossible without massive casualties. Besides, he said, sliding a tablet across the table showing bank account balances, you've been living off this money your entire life. Your mother's medical treatments, your education, your comfortable lifestyle, all paid for with profits from our partnership. You're already complicit, boy. The only question is whether you're going to be smart about it. That night, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. I was trapped between my father's legacy and my own conscience, between inherited wealth and inherited guilt. Everything I owned, everything I was, had been built on the suffering of innocent people. But Kozlov was right about one thing, I was already complicit. Even if I'd been ignorant, I'd benefited from blood money my entire life. The breaking point came when Sophia called me at 3 a.m, her voice panicked and urgent. Marcus, there's a shipment coming in tonight. Container CSX 7791. You need to see this if you're going to understand what you're inheriting. I met her at the port in the pre-dawn darkness. Using her security clearance and my executive access, we made our way to the arrival dock where the MV Pacific Dream, one of our cargo ships, was being unloaded. The CSX 7791 container was being moved to the secure storage area, handled with unusual care by port workers who seemed nervous and hurried. 43 people, Sophia whispered as we watched from the shadows. Families from rural Cambodia, promised jobs in restaurants and factories. They've been at sea for 18 days. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. When the container doors opened, the smell hit us first, human waste, vomit, death. Then came the sounds, sobbing, coughing, desperate voices speaking in languages I didn't understand but whose meaning was universal. These were people at the absolute limit of human endurance. The first person to emerge was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, carrying a child who wasn't moving. She collapsed on the concrete, clutching the small body and screaming in a language that needed no translation. Her child had died during the crossing, probably days ago, and she'd been trapped in that metal box with the body. More people stumbled out, men and women so dehydrated they could barely walk, children with eyes that had seen too much suffering. Several didn't emerge at all. Through the container doors, I could see bodies wrapped in blankets, people who had paid everything they owned for the chance at a new life and instead found only death in a steel tomb. I watched Kozlov's men sort the survivors like livestock. The healthy ones were loaded into unmarked vans, probably destined for illegal factories or brothels. The sick and injured were left for cleanup crews to handle quietly. The dead would be cremated without names, their families back home never knowing what happened to their loved ones. That moment, watching a mother hold her dead child while criminals calculated the profit margin on human misery, I knew I couldn't be part of this system for another second. Whatever the consequences, whatever Kozlov might do to me, I had to try to stop it. But first, I needed evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, working with Sophia, I documented everything. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. Shipping manifests with coded language indicating human cargo. Photographs of the container conversions, the scratch marks on the walls, the improvised sanitation facilities. Video recordings of the arrival process, the sorting of survivors, the disposal of bodies. I also discovered something that broke my heart all over again. Hidden in my mother's personal effects, which I'd never had the courage to examine after her death, I found letters she'd written but never sent. She had known about the trafficking operation, had discovered it during the final months of her life when the cancer treatments weren't working and she'd spent sleepless nights reviewing family finances. "I can't be complicit anymore," she had written in a letter addressed to my father. "These people have names, families, dreams. We've turned them into cargo, Richard. We're murderers who wash our hands with charitable donations and tell ourselves we're good people. I would rather die poor and clean than live wealthy and stained with innocent blood." In another letter, clearly written shortly before her death, she addressed me directly, "My dear Marcus, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've learned the truth about our family's wealth. I couldn't find the courage to expose your father while I was alive. I was too afraid of losing everything, of what it would mean for your future. I was a coward, and that cowardice is eating me alive worse than any cancer. Please, my son, be braver than I was. Choose differently. Choose to be someone I could be proud of." Reading my mother's words, I understood that her rapid decline in those final months wasn't just physical. She had died of a broken heart, unable to live with the knowledge of what our comfortable life had cost in human suffering. The final confrontation came when I learned about an incoming shipment that would be the largest yet, over 60 people packed into 2 containers, including entire families with young children. Kozlov had decided to test the limits of the operation, seeing how many people could be transported while maintaining an acceptable profit margin. Based on previous shipments, I knew that at least 20 people would die during the crossing. I couldn't let it happen. Working with Elena Vasquez, who had reluctantly agreed to help once she saw my evidence, I contacted Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. Agent Martinez was a career federal investigator who had been tracking trafficking operations for over a decade. "We've suspected Chin Industries for years," she told me during our clandestine meeting in a coffee shop in Pasadena. "But we could never get close enough to gather actionable evidence. The corruption goes all the way up to the district attorney's office." Together, we developed a plan. I would continue playing the role of the naive heir while wearing recording equipment provided by the FBI. The goal was to capture Kozlov and his associates discussing the operation in detail, providing evidence that couldn't be dismissed or covered up by corrupt officials. The most dangerous part was the timing. The shipment was arriving in 3 days, and we needed to coordinate federal raids on multiple locations simultaneously: the port facility, the processing warehouse, and Kozlov's other operations throughout the city. If we moved too early or too late, evidence would be destroyed and people would disappear. The night before the raid, I met with Kozlov one final time. He had requested dinner at his private club in Century City, a place where wealthy men conducted business away from prying eyes. I was wearing a wire, but knew that if he suspected anything, I would probably not leave the building alive. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately, Marcus," Kozlov said over brandy and cigars. "Your curiosity is starting to make people nervous." I played the part of the overwhelmed heir, claiming I just wanted to understand my father's business completely. Kozlov seemed satisfied with this explanation, perhaps convinced that my privileged upbringing had made me too soft for serious opposition. "Tomorrow's shipment will be very profitable," he continued, apparently deciding I could be trusted. 62 passengers, paying premium prices for family passage. We've made modifications to the containers, increased capacity while maintaining adequate life support. He showed me photographs on his phone, families boarding ships in Cambodia, holding hands and smiling, believing they were beginning a journey toward a better life. Children clutching toys and parents clutching documents promising jobs and housing in America. The beauty of the operation, Kozlov explained with genuine enthusiasm, is that everyone profits. The passengers get what they want, passage to America. The American businesses get what they want, cheap, motivated labor. We get what we want, compensation for providing this service. Even the government officials get what they want, regular payments for maintaining their selective blindness. When I asked about the deaths, the people who didn't survive the journey, Kozlov shrugged dismissively. Overhead, he said simply. Every business has acceptable losses. Your father struggled with this concept, but you strike me as more pragmatic. The recording equipment captured everything, his casual discussion of human lives as profit margins, his detailed explanation of the bribery network, his complete lack of remorse for the suffering his operation caused. The next morning, federal agents raided multiple locations simultaneously. At the port, they intercepted the containers before they could be moved to the processing facility. When the doors opened, they found 58 survivors and 4 bodies, a tragic loss, but far better than what would have happened if the operation had continued. Kozlov was arrested at his Beverly Hills mansion, along with dozens of associates throughout the trafficking network. The raid uncovered financial records, communications, and physical evidence that exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of local government. But the victory came at enormous personal cost. Within hours of Kozlov's arrest, I began receiving death threats from associates who had escaped the raids. Federal marshals provided security, but made it clear that my safety could never be guaranteed as long as I remained wealthy enough to be a target. More importantly, I couldn't live with myself knowing that every dollar I spent had been paid for with human suffering. The mansion in Pacific Palisades, the expensive cars, the investment portfolios, all of it felt like poison. Over the following months, I worked with attorneys and federal investigators to liquidate Chin Industries completely. Every asset was sold, every account emptied. After paying legal fees and settling lawsuits filed by trafficking survivors, I established the Chen Foundation for Human Trafficking Prevention, with Elena Vasquez as executive director. The foundation uses the entire proceeds from my father's empire to combat human trafficking worldwide. We fund rescue operations, provide support services for survivors, and work with law enforcement agencies to prosecute traffickers. Every penny that was earned through human suffering is now dedicated to preventing that suffering for others. The legal proceedings took over a year. Kozlov was sentenced to life in prison without parole, along with 14 associates. 37 government officials were arrested on corruption charges. The trafficking network that had operated for 2 decades was completely dismantled. But the human cost was staggering. During the investigation, authorities discovered that over 3,000 people had been transported in Chin Industries containers over the years. Nearly 800 had died during crossings. Hundreds more had been murdered when they tried to escape from forced labor situations. Today, I work as a victim advocate, helping trafficking survivors navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. I live in a small apartment in East LA, take the bus to work, and earn barely enough to cover my basic expenses. My bank account shows $423, and I've never been happier. Last week, I received a letter from Maria Santos, a young woman who was rescued from one of our containers 5 years ago. She's now a nursing student at UCLA, married with a baby daughter. Thank you, she wrote, for choosing to save lives instead of make money. Thank you for showing me that some people will sacrifice everything to do what's right. The guilt will never completely leave me. I was complicit in human trafficking for 28 years, even if I was ignorant about it. I benefited from blood money, lived comfortably while others suffered in steel containers crossing the Pacific Ocean. But I've learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing differently in the present. I visit my parents' graves every month, usually on Sunday afternoons when the cemetery is quiet. I tell my father that I understand the impossible choices he faced, the desperate circumstances that led him into partnership with criminals. But I also tell him that I chose differently, that I found a way to break the cycle of complicity and violence. To my mother, I say the words I wish I could have said while she was alive: I was braver than you thought I could be. I chose to be someone you could be proud of. The Chen Foundation has now helped rescue over 500 trafficking survivors and prevented countless others from falling victim to similar operations. We've worked with law enforcement agencies in 12 countries to dismantle trafficking networks and prosecute the criminals who profit from human misery. Elena, who once threw me out of her office with disgust and anger, is now one of my closest friends and collaborators. You chose the hard path, she told me recently as we reviewed case files in our cramped office. Most people in your position would have taken the money and found ways to rationalize keeping it. You chose to sacrifice everything to save people you'd never meet. But I don't see it as sacrifice. I see it as paying a debt that was long overdue. Every person we rescue, every trafficking operation we help shut down, every survivor we help rebuild their life, it's not charity or generosity. It's justice. It's using blood money to stop the bleeding. The Foundation's office is in the same building where Elena ran her original survivor shelter. The walls are covered with photographs and letters from people we've helped, families reunited, children who escaped forced labor, women who survived sexual trafficking and are now living free lives. Each face represents a choice to prioritize human dignity over profit, conscience over comfort. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. If I'd taken Kozlov's advice and maintained my willful blindness. If I'd kept the money and found ways to rationalize my inheritance. I would be living in a mansion instead of a one-bedroom apartment. I would be driving luxury cars instead of taking public transportation. I would have more zeros in my bank account and fewer sleepless nights. But I would also be complicit in ongoing human trafficking. I would be using money earned through the suffering of innocent people to fund a comfortable lifestyle. I would be the kind of person who can sleep peacefully while others are trapped in steel containers, crossing oceans in conditions that kill some of them. That person, wealthy, comfortable, and morally compromised, feels like a stranger to me now. The man I am today, with $423 and a clear conscience, is someone I can respect when I look in the mirror. The work is far from over. Human trafficking generates over $150 billion annually worldwide, making it one of the most profitable criminal enterprises on the planet. Millions of people are trapped in forced labor, sexual exploitation, and other forms of modern slavery. The demand for cheap goods and services creates market incentives for traffickers, while corruption and weak law enforcement allow the trade to flourish. But change is possible. Every trafficking network that gets dismantled, every survivor who reclaims their freedom, every corrupt official who faces justice, it all matters. The choices we make as individuals, as consumers, as voters, as human beings, they have consequences that ripple far beyond what we can see. My father thought he was making temporary compromises to save his family. He believed he could walk away clean once the business was successful. Instead, he became trapped in a system that treated human beings as commodities, and the guilt eventually killed him. But his story doesn't have to be the end of the story. I chose differently. I chose to break the cycle, to use inherited wealth for inherited responsibility. I chose to measure success not in dollars accumulated but in lives saved. I chose to be poor and clean rather than wealthy and stained. And that choice, difficult as it was, gave me back something more valuable than any bank account, the ability to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that I'm part of the solution rather than part of the problem. If you're listening to this story and thinking about your own choices, your own complicity in systems that exploit vulnerable people, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose differently. It's never too late to prioritize human dignity over personal comfort. It's never too late to use whatever resources, influence, or privileges you have to make the world a little bit better for someone else. The money is gone, the mansion is sold, the luxury lifestyle is over. But I am free in a way I never was when I was wealthy. Free from guilt, free from complicity, free from the knowledge that my comfort came at the cost of other people's suffering. My name is Marcus Chen, and I inherited my father's business and his victims' blood money. But I chose to wash my hands clean, to break the cycle, to use tainted wealth for righteous purposes. And if I had to make the choice again, knowing everything I know now about what it would cost me, I would make the same decision without hesitation. Because some things are worth more than money. Human dignity. Personal integrity. The ability to look trafficking survivors in the eye and know that you chose to help rather than exploit them. The peace that comes from knowing that you used your privileges to protect the vulnerable rather than profit from their desperation. That's worth more than $2.8 billion. That's worth everything.